And today in the studio, as we mentioned last week, we got the distinguished city attorney, Jacqueline Hubbard, and she's made a significant contribution in the area of law, not only in Lee County history, but for the entire state of Florida, as she's the first African-American city attorney for the entire state of Florida. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome our city attorney, Jacqueline Hubbard.
Good morning, Lee. How are you?
And very, very fine, thank you. Good to get you here on the show.
Thank you.
We're glad we could get you out here. You know, in my opening, I talked about the fact that you were the first African-American city attorney in the state of Florida. And a lot of people may not have even realized that. What do you find when you're out talking to people? Do most people find that surprising?
Well, no, I have to correct that statement. It's not the first African-American city attorney in the state of Florida, but the first African-American city attorney in the metropolitan area. There was an African-American city attorney in Opa-locka, which is a predominantly black community, and there's a city attorney in the area outside of West Palm Beach.
Okay, so those are little small areas, small town. And now let's talk in terms of, some people, when you say metropolitan, they may not know exactly what you mean by that. What do you mean when you say metropolitan area?
I mean a city with a mixed population of African Americans, white Americans, and other ethnic groups in the state of Florida.
Okay, let's talk about your coming here from, you're originally from the St. Petersburg area. You've been here about 6 years as the city attorney.
Right.
What about this area attracted you to Fort Myers?
Well, Southwest Florida is a very beautiful part of the state. It's a small town atmosphere, and it was the opportunity to become the city attorney that brought me here.
Okay, now in your early days as a child growing up, was law something that you were always interested in, or it sort of came about as you began to get into your studies?
I was always interested in it. It's pretty funny. When I was a little kid, my mother used to always tell me that I talked like a Philadelphia lawyer. Have you ever heard that expression?
No.
That's somebody who talked a lot.
Okay.
And that's what I did as a kid. I knew a few lawyers when I was growing up in North Carolina. I was actually born there. We moved to Florida when I was in the 8th grade. And I knew an attorney, African-American attorney, Attorney Menace in St. Petersburg. He used to come and talk to our class. And I didn't decide to become a lawyer, however, until I was in undergraduate school and just about ready to graduate.
Now, you raised the point that you knew at least one attorney, I know you mentioned. How significant do you think the fact that, as far as a role model is concerned, the fact that you had experience meeting an African-American attorney, how influential was that in shaping the way you turned out in terms of law?
That was somewhat influential. I think I was very fortunate because I think that I was lucky enough to come from a family of professional people from many, many generations back, which is fairly unusual, not just for African Americans in this country, but for most people in this country. My parents were both teachers. My father was a college professor. My mother was a 7th grade teacher. My grandfather was a medical doctor, physician in North Carolina. My great-grandfather was an educator, and so forth and so on, all the way back. And so I've always been very aware of my own family history, of which I've been very proud of. And so I had role models, I think, in terms of what I wanted to become. And I thought I would become something in the professional area, whether it would be a teacher or a doctor or an attorney. So
your goals were always pretty much like that, because that was the environment in which you matriculated in as a child. Let's stay with that for a minute, because that brings to mind an interesting point. Now, myself personally, I grew up in a family of laborers. My mom, she was sort of a maid type of a worker and a little bit of nursing, whereas my father was a truck driver. And I didn't see any role models in the sense of the professional world until I got out, and then I started realizing that some African Americans had grown up in environments where their parents and their grandparents may have been professionals and had those types of jobs, that they may have even had college degrees. I say that to say that, when did you realize as an African American that your situation at home was unique compared to a lot of other African American children who were growing up, in the sense that you had those types of people who were in the household?
Well, I think that's something, and I hope this is taken the right way. I think that's something that you grow up being aware of, because that's just the way you grow up, and you realize that things are a little bit different in the manner in which you grew up and the manner other people grew up. However, it didn't mean that you didn't interact or mingle with everybody else. It's just that you grew up in an area where your family was so old in that area, everybody knew who you were, who your grandfather was, your aunts and uncles and cousins, and you knew everybody else's aunts, uncles, and cousins. It didn't really make any difference in terms of who you related to, because in those days, anyway, the black community was so cohesive that everybody really got along with everybody.
That's an interesting point, the cohesiveness of the black community. We often talk about that as in your early days. Talk about some things that you saw as a youth that made you realize how cohesive the community was.
Well, I remember that my first grade teacher lived around the corner from me, and I remember being in the first grade, and I remember her standing me on her porch over the rail, and across the street was another teacher who had a student that she liked very much, and we had this little spelling bee. I remember that they used to do it all the time. She was always tell me, Jackie can really spell, and watch her spell, and the teacher across the street would bring out another little neighbor, and the two of us would have these little spelling bees across the street.
And great.
So it was very safe, and it was comfortable. My grandparents lived around the corner. The church was up the street.
What about businesses? Did you see many African Americans in your childhood who owned their own businesses in their local community?
There were always the doctors. There were the dentists. There were the teachers, there were the little shop owners, there were the barbers, there were always the people who did things like plumbers, and then of course there were the housekeepers who were all around the place, people who did that sort of thing, the people who did laundry, then there were people who cooked, and everybody interacted in the community because it was small, but it was a friendly place is what I recall.
Now in that same climate, that same environment, there was an opportunity, I would assume, for you to start having some understanding of your African American history within your family and outside of your family. How was that taught to you in your early days?
Well, I'm probably one of the last groups of people that had their entire educational background taught in a segregated system. I went to kindergarten, first grade, junior high school, and high school in a totally segregated atmosphere, in the sense that all of my teachers were African American. I used to start my when I went to the first grade, we'd start the day off by saying Pledge Allegiance to the flag and singing the Negro National Anthem every morning. We knew all about African American poets and writers and books and literature. Those things were taught to us. I remember one of the things I remember very, very strongly was learning to recite the poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar, Mother to Son, which I thought was pretty funny because I recited that poem and I have 4 brothers.
How long was that poem?
It's not a very long poem. It's a very beautiful poem.
Can we get you to do a little small portion of it?
Well, the part that says, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. The nails in it and tears in it, and it's all about the struggle that you go through to get from down here, from the first floor to upstairs to where it's better, and how you have to keep on struggling and going up those stairs even though it's very, very hard to do it, because once you get up there, things are so much better and the view is so much nicer.
But when you talk about that view from above in relation to the Paul Dunbar poem, and you were growing up in a what was a reasonably affluent environment in your household, how did you relate to that poem?
Oh, I love that poem.
I mean, in terms of what you weren't experiencing those difficulties as some people may have been experiencing.
Everybody experiences those difficulties if you're African
So you're not immune from that, being a city attorney?
No, of course not. I mean, you can't be immune from what happens even in your own household, even in your own family. I mean, even in your neighbor, what happens to your neighbors. I don't know of any African Americans that are so affluent that they are immune from that, and we certainly weren't wealthy, so I mean, no, that's definitely not the case.
When we say immune from that, we are primarily speaking of immune from racism and discrimination and some of those other social ills that many African Americans speak of. There are many people who will say that African Americans are paranoid, that
No.
they think that these things are set up, are happening around them, discrimination and racism and so on and so forth. What do you have to say to those people?
I don't think that's true. I think if you have any sense of your history or any sense of the history of this country, you will know that racism was real. It happened. Slavery actually occurred. I grew up in a state in which there was a long, long, long history of slave ownership. There's also a long, long history of a lot of free blacks in the state of North Carolina. Florida uniquely does not have a huge, massive slave history, which I think is very unique to Florida. But you have to know what your history is, and you have to acknowledge that it occurred, and you have to understand that you have to move past it. But if you don't know your history, you can't acknowledge what happened to you, and a lot of children don't, then you can't move past it. I think if you don't understand the history, you are destined to repeat it. And yes, racism is a part of this country's history.
Okay.
Just as progressivism is also, though.
That's right. Now, okay, so you have this interesting childhood experience that was what I would describe as a wonderful experience, and the strong family structure, your parents, your grandparents, being your teacher living across the street from you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, those kinds of days where you grew up in a segregated school system, and it produced a product like yourself from that type of an environment. What do you say now to individuals who may say, well, that was the best way to do things, to keep students in their community, going to schools in their community, having African American teachers, educating African American children, and having a sincere interest in them being able to be successful in life? Look at Jacqueline Hubbard. That was the kind of environment she came up in. Why do we go through this whole thing now, busting out children all over the place, breaking up the communities? Do you think that that type of environment is still something that would be applicable in today's society?
Well, you know, that was not necessarily the most conducive environment to achieve the best type of academic education. And there was not an equal distribution of resources in the African American school system and the predominantly white school system. And kids have to be exposed to the best academic resources there are available. And my time is past. The kind of education that I went through, that no longer is there. I'm not certain that I would prefer it. I certainly did not prefer it for my daughter. And I think that kids need to be prepared for a very rigorous academic competition, because that's the way the world is. I think that they need to get the best level and quality of education they can get. And I think they get that best in an integrated school system. So I'm a proponent and of busing. I think that integration is the way to go. I don't think that you can segregate or balkanize this country or this community. And I think that all different types of ethnic groups have to come and interact, because it's only knowledge of each other's culture that gives you the freedom to understand that you can like one another. And when you're separated off like that, you don't really understand each other. And I think it's the lack of understanding that causes the pain.
Now, so you make it through law school.
Yeah.
And you go on and you practice law. You started off before you came to Fort Myers. Let's talk a little bit about some of the law that you were involved in.
Well, I've always been involved in law for the people. I mean, I went to law school because I wanted to become a criminal lawyer, because at the time that I was going to law school, an awful lot of people whose politics I respected were being arrested and placed in jail and in prison. And I figured that I could make a contribution if I became a criminal defense attorney. So I went to law school, I became a defense attorney, and I practiced as a criminal lawyer, defense lawyer, for over 12 years.
Okay, now then you come to, eventually you work, or you end up in the Fort Myers area about 6 years ago.
6.
As the city attorney.
Right.
You make headlines, you front page of the newspaper. It's a significant point in black history, particularly here in the Lee County area. Mm. What was that like when you first came here?
Well, when I first came here, I was welcomed here. by all segments of the Fort Myers population. The black community welcomed me here. There were a number of receptions that were held for me. The predominantly white population welcomed me here. I was invited to participate in a number of civic activities, like Leadership Lee County, for instance.
Right, but did you feel any special pressure upon you that many African Americans who rise to a high level in society feel additional pressure because you were city attorney and you were African American, and maybe all eyes were going to be on you and you had to perform, and you were representing something more than just that, but you were representing your race?
Well, that's always the case. When I went off to college, I was the first African American to go from Florida to even attend the school I attended. You're always on display. You get used to being the first this and the first that, and the thing that you have to focus in on, which I try to do, is to do the best job I can do, which means that very often your job is very demanding. You spend a great deal of time working at that because what you want to do is be a winner. And to be a winner, you have to work really, really hard.
Now, when we talk about your position as a city attorney, you often deliberate or you're involved in making recommendations and legal discussions to the mayor or the city council about things that impact the city of Fort Myers from a legal perspective. Mm-hmm. And there are certain things that happen and decisions that are made and voted upon that have an impact on the African American community, whether it be a positive impact or a negative impact on the African American community. And how do you detach your race from issues that are related to your race as it relates to city politics?
As it relates to city politics, you will find that there are decisions that are generally made that affect the city as a whole, that may have some disparate impact on the African American community. Sometimes there are decisions that impact that community separately, zoning decisions perhaps, or decisions that will take place with code enforcement and things of that nature. I haven't really had to have any particularly heightened sensitivity, because there's a great deal of sensitivity in City Hall right now as it pertains to the African American community. You have a very progressive mayor. You have a very progressive city council for the most part. You have 2 African American women on the city council. And Dunbar is not an area whose needs are totally unaddressed. I think people are aware that a substantial part of the population in Fort Myers is African American, and they're responsive to it because of that. And the community itself demands that it be responded to. But
do you always remember that as you matriculated as a city attorney, are you always conscious of the fact that you're African American first and a city attorney, or you're a city attorney and African American? How do you do that? I mean, how do you kind of?
Well, I am who I am. I'm a woman. I am a mother. I'm an attorney. I'm an American. I'm African American. I'm all those things. I mean, and I don't separate them all in little categories. I mean, that's who I am. That's what you see. You see all those things roll up in this one little person right here.
Because the reason I bring that up is that Clarence Thomas, a lot of media attention during the time that he was being appointed to the Supreme Court. And there were many African Americans who said that once Clarence Thomas gets into the Supreme Court, he'll never forget that he's black. He'll always remember these things will come back, even though right now he doesn't, in their views, didn't seem to articulate being concerned about African Americans.
True.
Can you speak to that as it relates to Clarence Thomas and how you see the way Clarence Thomas has been functioning in that important position as it relates to African Americans?
Right. I think African American culture is a compassionate culture. And I think that we tend to think that people, if pushed, will be very, very good and decent. Mm-hmm. And that most of us felt that Clarence Thomas, when I say us, I mean, I think most African Americans felt that it's very difficult to believe that a person brought up in the same culture that we were brought up in could be insensitive enough to believe all the things that have been said about him. Now, however, as I read his opinions, which are in some cases appalling opinions, it is amazing that our community could have been so naive about this person.
Okay.
Because he is proven to be, extremely reactionary and extremely detrimental to many of the goals, not only of African Americans, but minorities in general.
Well, let's stay with that area, not necessarily Clarence Thomas. In this particular area, Lee County, we've had a lot of progress. I would say, I don't know if you would agree with me, with Judge Adams.
Wonderful.
Judge Anderson. We have Chief Hart now,
yes.
Fort Myers Police Department, Chief Honor Gibbs, Cape Coral.
We have Federal Judge Henry Lee Adams in the Middle District, which I think is, and we also have the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District, an African American, Charles Wilson.
And let's take all of that and let's put it in a nice little pot and make some gumbo and stir it all up. And when we stir it all up and the results that we get out of that, what kind of progress does that show and what does that hold for the future?
I think it shows, one, that Southwest Florida is progressive, that not only do you see minorities, African Americans in particular, in positions of authority, but you also see an awful lot of women in positions of authority in Southwest Florida. I think Mayor Smith should be commended. He probably has the most diverse city staff in any municipality in the state of Florida. I don't think he's often given credit for that. And it makes you feel pretty good about where you live.
Now, all of that being said, race relations here. And let's look at race relations and let's, in order to be able to understand how you're categorizing, let's look at A being race relations are the best that they could possibly be in any particular environment. And F being the worst conditions for race relations, and all those other alphabets in between as we do in school. What grade would you give the Lee County area in terms of its race relations when you first came to the Lee County area? And also, what grade would you give it now since you've been here for 6 years and had a chance to observe some more things?
I think that Fort Myers in particular deserves an A. And that's where I am. I live in Fort Myers. As I said before, I think you've got an extraordinarily responsible, progressive, municipal government. I think you have a mayor who's willing to make appointments that are controversial. He has appointed African Americans. He's appointed lots of females in leadership positions. I don't think he's regretted it. Any of those decisions.
No, when you
have two African American females on the city council, and you have an African American police chief.
Okay, now when we talk about race relations as it relates to the city of Fort Myers, and you were speaking in terms of political and that type of thing, let's get away from that for a minute. Let's just say, in general, amongst the citizenry, how are they interacting now, in your opinion, in terms of race relations, in terms of housing, in terms of how they socialize, the school, how the students are matriculating? Do you feel that we as in Fort Myers gets an A in terms of the way the community interacts race-wise?
No, I think the community could interact much more than it does. But I also understand from being a product of the South that there are patterns of behavior and housing patterns that go back generations. I mean, go back to the 1800s. I mean, Dunbar, for instance, as an African-American community, has probably existed as an African-American community for a very, very long time, just as the areas on the river have. And no, I believe that there's a lot of room for improvement, but the difference is that I think in the city of Fort Myers in particular, there's some other outlying areas, I think, in Lee County also, there is a mood, as long as this mood remains, that will continue to be progressive. When you go around in Fort Myers, you feel welcome everywhere you go, don't you? I mean, have you ever been any place where you didn't feel welcome, walking to a restaurant or walking to a church or anything like that, that you didn't feel that you were fairly comfortable in?
I can say that I've been pretty well welcomed in the community.
Yeah, it's a pretty friendly place, I think.
Okay, but I guess what I'm trying to get at now, I guess what you're saying is that as you look at the political structure and the people who are in elected offices, the image that they portray and the way that things are diverse there and the policies that they try and implement has a tendency to filter down through the community. So if you look at a community, you have a good understanding of how race relations are. If you look at the people who are making a lot of decisions that affect the community, is that where you?
Yes, and if you look at the effect it's had on the community. When I came here 6 years ago, for instance, Velasco Village was just beginning. Now there are over 100 houses in what was one of the ugliest slum areas I'd ever seen anywhere, which was right here in Fort Myers. And they're cleaning it up, and it's getting better, and things continue to get better.
Now, let's, we got about 3 minutes left. This has been really interesting. I would hate to say that this has been my best show, because I just said that last week with Pastor Damon. And then I'll be...
and that was a great show with Pastor Damon.
You got a chance to see that show?
Yes, I did.
Yeah. He talked a lot about family values. He talked a lot about educating our community, our children. And as an attorney who's in the position that you are, what's your opinion on the importance of you as a person being able to share your knowledge with other African Americans and maybe lift other people up to that level? And what are you doing in that process?
Well, I try to go around the community and talk to children as often as I can. Anytime anybody asks me to do it, I always do it. I enjoy that.
Are you involved in the National Bar Association?
Very much so. I've been involved in an organization since I became a lawyer.
Tell us about that right quick.
It was an organization that was founded in 1925 by a group of African-American lawyers in this country when African-Americans were not permitted to join the American Bar Association. And there were two segregated bar associations, the African-American Bar Association and the predominantly white Bar Association. And I've always maintained my membership in both, but I have a real sentimental attachment to the National Bar Association. I think it needs to exist. I support it. And it's always been very good for me. So I go to its functions. I interact with other lawyers who are part of it. Well,
Jacqueline Hubbard, City Attorney, I tell you, I wish we could go on with this interview. But duty does call, and we're going to have to end. I'd like to thank you for coming out and joining us this morning on our Black History Profile. You just got a chance to hear our City Attorney, Jacqueline Hubbard, who talked a little bit about her past. I hope that enlightened you and inspired you. As we continue our Black History Profiles here on Up Close on Sunday morning, keep in mind we will be coming to you this Tuesday at 6 o'clock with a fresh show. And then we'll be back next week with another Black History Profile at 8:30 a.m. right here in Studio 353 at eView TV. Next week we'll have Abduak Muhammad, the director of the Quality Life Program. Remember, for those who say it can't be done, they're usually interrupted by those who are doing it. Jacqueline Hubbard, thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. We'll see you this Tuesday, and we'll be right back next Sunday.